You don't need to be a historian to know that war is anything but orderly. But even amidst all of the chaos, there's some details from these conflicts that stand out as especially bizarre.
The Korean War is often remembered for being forgotten, sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War. But the deadly Cold War conflict was immensely important, and plenty of strange things happened. Of all the major players in the forgotten war, Donald Nichols might be the one America tried hardest to forget. His knack for languages and complete lack of conscience helped him gain favor with South Korean strongman Syngman Rhee.
He attended torture sessions, he attended mass killings.
There were beheadings.
I found a photograph of him standing next to a severed head.
Cold and calculating, he would make himself indispensable to US and South Korean forces during the war. Thanks to a North Korean defector with stolen military codebooks, Nichols had the means to decipher enemy communications and foil their operations. Rather than sharing that crucial info with intelligence agencies, he formed his own group of codebreakers, forcing the US and South Korea to rely on him. Because of how important he was, Nichols literally got away with murder. When subordinates disagreed with him, he shoved them out of airplanes and off of boats. He even had a shootout with his own agents. After the war, the US military got sick of Nichols and had him placed in a straitjacket and subjected to months of electroshock therapy. If you need to patch up bullet holes in sub-zero temperatures, Tootsie Rolls are a godsend. Thanks to a ridiculous but fortuitous mix-up, Marines discovered that wacky fact amid the bitterest battle of the Korean War. As history detailed, in the early months of the war, North Korean forces were so overwhelmed that General Douglas MacArthur predicted the whole thing would be wrapped up by Christmas. Then, Chinese troops unexpectedly entered the fray at North Korea's Chosin Reservoir, a region loathingly dubbed Frozen Chosin by the Marines. Instead of crushing North Korean communists, the Marines found themselves cornered by 100,000 Chinese combatants in a mountainous region where temperatures reached as low as minus 25 degrees. So they embarked on a 70-mile retreat. Bullet wounds froze in the perilous cold, and ice-cold corpses were used as sandbags. As ammunition dwindled, the troops requested an airdrop of 60mm mortar ammo, which Marines referred to by the codename Tootsie Rolls. However, the radio operator mistakenly called in an urgent order for the chocolate candy of the same name. The Marines found out they could melt Tootsie Rolls in their mouths and form a kind of putty that would seal bullet hole-ridden equipment as it froze. That MacGyver-like ingenuity allowed them to accomplish their mission and take out several Chinese divisions. Before we dig into this, it's important to keep in mind that the term UFO literally just refers to any flying object that an eyewitness didn't recognize. But what counted as a UFO for GIs during the Korean War? As history recounted, in 1951, troops stationed roughly 60 miles north of Seoul described seeing a jack-o'-lantern come wafting down across the mountain. Eyewitnesses claimed the craft could hover and emitted an orange and later blue-green flashing light. Attempts to down it with armor-piercing bullets caused the craft to move unpredictably. Before racing away, it unleashed waves of light that allegedly caused a burning, tingling sensation. 3 days later, everyone in the unit was too sick to walk. The men were diagnosed with everyone's favorite wartime illness, dysentery. However, an ex-NASA scientist thought their symptoms were consistent with radiation poisoning. Were the men the victims of a Soviet death ray, as some suggested? Perhaps stress made the troops hallucinate. If so, at least 42 witnesses had an eerily similar delusion. Ceasefire negotiations started in 1951, and as The Atlantic reported, North Korea desperately wanted to look strong. During one session, North Korea's lead negotiator spent 2 hours and 11 minutes staring at a U.S. vice admiral and silently chain-smoking. Among other tactics, the legs of the admiral's chair were also shortened to make the negotiator appear taller. But all absurdity broke loose when the North Koreans noticed that the UN flag on the conference table was bigger than theirs. Evidently feeling emasculated, North Korea brought out a bigger flag. Then South Korea whipped out an even bigger flag, triggering history's most Freudian conflict. According to The Independent, North and South Korea kept one-upping each other until neither nation's flags fit inside the conference room. Eventually, South Korea erected a 323-foot pole and the North responded with a 525-foot pole, which for a while was the tallest on Earth. Following the 1953 ceasefire, America and North Korea maintained a mostly bloodless animosity toward each other. However, in 1976, they verged on all-out war after a disagreement over a tree. Located in the demilitarized zone, the 40-foot poplar blocked a United Nations command observation post from viewing a checkpoint, according to The Atlantic. So, U.S. Army captains attempted to trim the tree. North Korea balked at the idea, and the infamously belligerent Lieutenant Pak Chul warned, "The branches that are cut will be of no use, just as you will be after you die." The captains continued trimming, so Pak commanded 30 North Koreans to kill them, and assailants beat them to death. The U.S. was incensed, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger suggested attacking a North Korean barracks. President Ford opted for a ginormous show of force dubbed Operation Paul Bunyan. American aircraft carriers entered Korean waters, and North Korea responded by assuming full combat readiness. The ordeal ended with hundreds of heavily armed U.S. and South Korean troops amassing in the DMZ to oversee the tree trimming, while heavily armed North Koreans watched. During the 1960s, the demilitarized zone wasn't living up to its name. As the BBC described, the not-so-demilitarized zone was strewn with landmines, and battles between North and South Korean forces were commonplace. U.S. Army Sergeant Charles Jenkins was assigned to help keep the non-existent peace, but his mind was occupied by war, namely the Vietnam War, which he feared was his next destination. By 1965, the DMZ was at its most acrimonious, and Jenkins couldn't cope with his circumstances, fearing that he would cause other soldiers to be killed. In a panic, he crossed into North Korea, which he hoped would send him to the Soviet Union to seek amnesty. North Korea kept Jenkins all to itself. Held against his will, he was habitually tortured and also viewed as a useful propaganda tool, even forced to star in North Korean movies. Eventually, he married a Japanese nurse who had been kidnapped by the North Korean government. In 2002, Japan arranged for her release, and 2 years later, Jenkins was allowed to leave. After turning himself in to U.S. military police, he was tried for desertion and sentenced to 30 days in prison.
Do you think of yourself as a traitor?
No. If I was a traitor, I wouldn't have come back.
During the Korean War, North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung orchestrated the abduction of an estimated 84,000 South Koreans, as Kim Il-sung longed to make up for the mass exodus that occurred when Japan occupied the Korean peninsula. After World War II, Japan was ousted, North and South Korea were formed, and the newly formed rivals competed to see which could establish itself as the legitimate homeland of the Korean people. After the 1953 armistice, North Korea continued its forced repopulation project, primarily abducting South Korean fishermen. This went on for decades, and Reuters reported that South Korea scarcely acknowledged the kidnappings for fear of angering its ornery northern neighbor. Between 1977 and 1983, North Korea also kidnapped somewhere between 20 and 100 Japanese citizens, often hauling them away from their homeland in sacks. Prisoners were forced to train North Koreans to pass as foreigners for espionage operations, or to conduct spy missions themselves. U.S. Sergeant Jenkins, who we mentioned earlier, claimed North Korea had a spy breeding program that involved having prisoners produce interracial children with Koreans. Admitting fault makes people feel weak and embarrassed, for Scientific American, and apologizing to someone is often seen as yielding control. However, in 1968, America had to swallow its pride and apologize to North Korea. Per NPR, North Korean ships attacked the USS Pueblo, a spy vessel pretending to conduct environmental research near North Korea. One crewman was killed, and the remaining 82 Americans were imprisoned and tortured for 11 months. To save his crew from execution, Lieutenant Commander Pete Bucher confessed to espionage. In addition to Bucher's declaration, North Korea demanded an apology from the U.S. government. It was a diplomatic pickle for President Johnson, who had tried and failed to intimidate North Korea into releasing the crewmen, who found some interesting ways to rebel.
The Americans told the North Koreans, naive about American culture, that they would show the Hawaiian good luck sign. What they really did was raise the middle finger.
However, the Vietnam War was intensifying, and it was better to have wounded pride than more wounded soldiers. So, an American negotiator signed an apology letter while verbally denying its validity. Nonetheless, North Korea kept the captured ship as a trophy. North Korea's track record of aggressive gestures is long and insane. The scary part is that North Korea possesses an estimated 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. The US has tried to curb the country's nuclear ambitions through sanctions and condemnations, but it might be tough to persuade them after the US destroyed North Korea and threatened it with nukes for decades. Most of the Korean War was fought under President Truman, who atomically bombed Japan during World War II. In 1950, he considered doing the same to North Korea, and according to Air and Space magazine, he almost did. To show he meant business, Truman held a press conference to announce that he'd do anything to win, including nuking the enemy. He even ordered mock atomic bombing runs and authorized a general to use the nuclear option if he saw fit. America instead used hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives, according to Newsweek. And beginning in 1958, the US deployed nuclear weapons in South Korea for 33 years to deter the North, per the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Fearing a US invasion, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung began trying to build nukes in the 1980s. The Korean War had an enormous death toll. As many as 5 million people perished, and the Koreas lost about 10% of their civilian populations, according to history. Until 2000, the official U.S. death toll was listed as 54,246, a number literally etched in granite on the Korean War Veterans Memorial. That figure was entirely too high. We don't mean that morally or philosophically. The actual death toll was 36,516. In other words, the official tally was almost 50% too high for half a century. In a baffling clerical error that apparently went unnoticed, the death toll included fatalities from around the world, per the Washington Post. Excluding the deaths proved controversial, however, as some Korean War veterans felt it devalued the already overlooked sacrifices of those who fought in the Forgotten War. Korean legend has it that the peninsula's first kingdom was founded by a dude named Dangun, whose father was the king of heaven and whose mother was a bear that transformed into a beautiful woman after spending 100 days in a cave avoiding sunlight. South Korean professor Jeong Young-hun explained, because he establishes a sense of shared origins and cultural oneness, that Dangun is a basis for Koreans to feel the necessity for pursuing harmony and unification. That elusive reunion seemed a little more attainable in 2018 when North and South Korea's leaders met and visited the mythical birthplace of Dangun together.
Most Americans have heard the history of the American Revolution again and again, but no matter how much you think you know, there are plenty of things about the war that gave rise to our nation that don't make sense. Though teasing out the causes of the American Revolution is seriously complicated, one in particular stands out: representation.
No taxation without representation.
Exactly. It also doesn't just pop up out of nowhere right before the war. You see, in 1764 Massachusetts, colonist James Otis published the Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, in which he argued that giving the colonists a seat in government wouldn't weaken Britain, writing, "This would firmly unite all parts of the British Empire in the greatest peace and prosperity, and render it invulnerable and perpetual."
Even as we shoot down British soldiers, we will be winning rights their children shall enjoy forever.
Even if Britain didn't 100% agree, why didn't they change course when the rebellion turned into full-out war? Well, actually, they did. In 1778, Britain sent a group of representatives known as the Carlisle Commission to the colonies with a proposal: stop the war, and you can rule yourselves. But the members of the Continental Congress could feel the momentum of the revolution, not to mention that they were wary of allegations of corruption and collaboration with the commission. In other words, the enemy. They nixed the proposal, although a fun little what-if is, would it have been so roundly rejected had all the representatives been there for the vote? Well, it's easy to understand why farmers and other working-class folks might want freedom from the British Crown. A surprising number of elite upper-class colonists were firmly in the Revolution camp as well. Take Virginia, for example. The higher-ranking members of Virginia society got to North America by virtue of the colonial system. Not only that, they continued to enjoy plenty of big and little luxuries imported from Britain. So why would they choose to support a scrappy breakaway republic?
One that speaks loud.
Turns out they did it for the most American of reasons. They couldn't get high-end goods. You see, as time went on, trade was hampered by British taxes, as were fancy foreign imports. Wealthy planters began to worry that their financial situation was being undercut by money-hungry Britain. Some were concerned that the growing discontent might shatter the social order, giving enslaved people the idea that they deserved equal rights. With that in mind, the revolution became a way for elites to maintain the financial and social order that elevated them without interference from Britain. And they were right. While slavery was outlawed across the British Empire in the 1830s, it took a bloody civil war and a constitutional amendment to outlaw U.S. slavery, which didn't happen until 1865. You don't have to do a deep dive into early American history to realize the colonists were never going to win a war against the all-powerful British by themselves. Luckily, France came along with a major assist. But while it's clear that France and a few other nations lent serious help to the budding republic, it's not so obvious why. At the time, France was a pre-revolution monarchy that supported both the aristocracy and Catholicism. Why would they train, supply, and fund a bunch of ragtag rebels facing off against a growing British Empire? For one thing, the ragtag bit is more of a myth than strict reality. Moreover, the cultural differences between the American colonists and the French may not have been quite as stark as it sounds. Sure, King Louis XVI was still in power, but the Enlightenment had come to France in full force, bringing with it new ideas about society and government that were explicitly echoed in what Thomas Jefferson and company wrote in the Declaration of Independence. There were political factors to consider also. France and Britain had long been rivals, so helping the rebels meant striking a blow against an old enemy, not to mention making friends with a new nation that produced all sorts of profitable crops and goods. That's likely the major reason why nations like Spain and the Netherlands joined France in supporting the not-so-ragtag revolutionists. Might as well profit and keep the Brits down. There were plenty of times during the American Revolution when George Washington barely escaped serious injury or death. He was the subject of a 1776 assassination plot, barely avoided being captured by the British in New York, and led its December 1776 surprise attack that could have proven disastrous, although it turned out to be the rebels' first real win of the war. Washington's closest brush with disaster came at the September 11, 1777 Battle of Brandywine.
At Brandywine, Pennsylvania, the Americans fought the largest engagement of the war so far, and Washington suffered one of his worst losses.
British Lieutenant General Sir William Howe forced Washington's army into a battle at Brandywine Creek near Philadelphia. It was a loss for the Continentals, but not a crushing defeat, since many colonial soldiers managed to retreat safely. But Washington himself had an alarmingly close call. For a few moments at least, an enemy sharpshooter had him in his sights. His name was Captain Patrick Ferguson, widely touted as the best marksman in the British Army. Crouched along the creek, Ferguson saw a group of rebel officers pass nearby. He ordered the soldiers under his command to shoot, but canceled the order at the last second. According to the Philadelphia campaign by Thomas J. McGuire, Ferguson felt it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty. Pride in his craft kept Ferguson from taking out George Washington. It might be the biggest what if that would have completely changed America as we know it today. Charles Lee was a British officer who joined the colonists in 1775. He was commissioned as a major general in the Continental Army and at first enjoyed the acclaim of his fellow commanders, eventually becoming the Army's second in command. But Lee came into such frequent and dramatic conflict with Washington that his once stellar reputation began to tarnish. He's now considered one of the worst generals of the American Revolution. At the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Washington criticized Lee for his messy, confusing command.
Lee's lack of confidence in his own men saw them abandon the fight within the first hour of battle.
Lee's response was so spicy that he was charged with insubordination and temporarily removed. Clearly not knowing when he ought to mind his manners, Lee became such a constant problem that he was accused of treason and permanently dismissed in 1780.
Removing Lee cemented Washington's unquestioned role as commander-in-chief for the remainder of the war.
While Lee's rash decisions are plenty confusing, an earlier incident in his career makes things even weirder. In 1776, after the British took New York City, Lee was captured and held a prisoner of war for 2 years. During that time, he wrote to Sir William Howe with inside advice on how to defeat the rebels, although those letters didn't become public until after Lee's 1782 death. There are accusations that he even came up with a concrete plan to hand the colonies back to Britain. Others wonder if he may have been a canny double agent or simply a difficult man who perhaps wrestled with untreated mental health issues. So who was the real Charles Lee?
It's a mystery! It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
In a war full of dramatic episodes, few are more gut-wrenching than the story of British Major John Andre. He's perhaps most notorious for basically being Benedict Arnold's connection, facilitating his betrayal and an attempted takeover of the fort at West Point, New York.
In exchange for £20,000, I shall transfer to you the plans for West Point.
The plot failed, and Andre was captured and executed in October 1780. Though Andre's execution was ordered by George Washington, the reasons aren't clear. Washington was said to have admired Andre and may even have seen him as a poor sap caught between two opposing sides. He even offered to return Andre to the British in exchange for Arnold, but was turned down. Something about the whole thing didn't make sense. The day before his death, Andre reached out to Washington for mercy, writing, "If aught in my character impresses you with esteem towards me, if aught in my misfortunes marks me as a victim of policy and not of resentment, I shall experience the operation of these feelings in your breast by being informed that I am not to die on a gibbet." Other officers thought Andre should at least be given the dignity of death by firing squad and not the hanging accorded to common criminals. Yet Washington and other Continental Army commanders voted to have him hanged anyway. Major General Nathaniel Greene argued that it was a fitting death for a spy, but Washington never explained his decision. The rebels got a big assist from a group known as the Culper Spy Ring. They were based in Setauket, Long Island, and organized by a cavalry officer named Benjamin Talmadge.
What are you doing here? I saw Ben Talmadge trying to recruit me for a secret mission.
Many of those involved have since been revealed, including farmer Abraham Woodhull and sailor Caleb Brewster. But one member of the ring remains unknown to this day, Agent 355. Talmadge used numbers and code names known as the Culper Code to conceal identities.
355 in the Culper Code meant lady.
Agent 355 is mentioned just once by Woodhull, according to Morton Pennypacker's General Washington's spies, who quotes, "I think by the assistance of a 355 of my acquaintance, we shall be able to outwit them all." But a close reading, the assistance of a 355, reveals that Talmadge may not be speaking about a full-on spy, but using a generic term, not an actual code name.
This is war. You never know who's listening.
Still, people love to speculate about the mysterious woman's identity. Some folks point to Anna Strong, a Long Island resident who was Woodhull's neighbor and whose husband supported the rebellion. She allegedly communicated with agents, reportedly hanging a black petticoat on a washing line if a message was ready for pickup. Other candidates included a unnamed lover of Agent 723, Robert Townsend, and none other than Benedict Arnold's sweetheart, Peggy Shippen. The opening lines of the Declaration of Independence read, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
Not only a declaration of our independence, but of the rights of all men.
But dig a little deeper, and that notion is complicated by some of the Founding Fathers. In a 1776 letter to James Sullivan, John Adams contemplated the idea of letting non-elites vote. Adams thought the notion dangerous, or at least a major political headache, writing, "There will be no end of it. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who is not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state." Adams, the second U.S. president, was part of the land-owning elite guaranteed voting rights under the colonial system. He had an estimated net worth of $21.5 million in modern US dollars and owned a 40-acre estate. But skepticism about democracy wasn't an Adams-only problem. Other founding fathers were wary of populism and initially ensured that only members of the House of Representatives were elected by popular vote. In fact, senators weren't elected by popular vote until 1913, with the ratification of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. When it comes to the American Civil War, we think we know what happened and why, but do we? Even 160 years later, there are things about the conflict that make no sense, at least in retrospect. When Louisiana joined the Confederacy in early 1861, it brought with it the thriving port of New Orleans, a wealthy and populous city that was, briefly, the largest in the Southern Coalition, for about a second, that is. Because New Orleans was the first major Southern city to be captured by Union forces, surrendering in April 1862. This was a huge blunder on the part of the Confederacy. They looked, to put it bluntly, totally incompetent, and not without good reason. They'd just basically given up one of their side's greatest assets and set the Union up to start clawing back control of the vital Mississippi River from both directions. And on top of that, the Union also made away with $800,000 in gold that had been stored in the Dutch consul's office. How had the Confederacy biffed so hard? New Orleans had few defenses around the town itself. They counted on Forts Jackson and St. Philip, two small Mississippi River outposts, to stop any ships trying to move north to the city. And there was a heavy chain that could be stretched across the river to prevent ships from passing. Union Navy Captain David Farragut simply broke the chain and sent its boats right through, while gunships fired on the Confederate forts, limiting their ability to respond. Sounds basic, but the strategy worked. and New Orleans fell into Union hands like a freshly fried beignet. It wasn't far from Confederate Virginia, like it was this close, but the North didn't move the U.S. capital from Washington during the war. As for the Confederacy, they originally and wisely made Montgomery, Alabama their capital city. Good move, keeping the center of their government far from Union forces. But then they changed their minds. Once Virginia seceded, the Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond and kept it there until shortly before the end of the war.
It's only 100 miles from Washington, D.C. Seems kind of stupid.
They did have a good reason for the move. Short answer is that Virginia was important. Richmond was the second largest city in the Confederacy after New Orleans, which means it's the largest city in the Confederacy. It was also relatively industrial, contributing essential factories to the agricultural South's war effort. Then there was the psychological factor. Virginia was heavily associated with the Revolution, so it was somewhat of a catch for the South. The people of Virginia would pay a heavy price for the defiant, even sassy placement of the Confederate capital. Northern Virginia was one of the most horrific meat grinders of the war, and by war's end, Richmond was in ruins.
The art of war is simple enough. Fight it out till the end.
Well, the almost end. Danville, Virginia served as the capital of the Confederacy at the very, very end of the war from about April 3rd to April 10th. The Civil War ended in 1865, so even the youngest veterans would have been lucky to reach the middle of the next century. And yet, 90-year-old Irene Triplett died in North Carolina in May 2020, having collected a Civil War pension of $73.13 per month until her very last day. When Triplett was born, her mother Elida Hall was 34, but her father Mose Triplett was 83. Originally in the Confederate Army with the 26th North Carolina Infantry, Mose had conveniently fallen ill before the Battle of Gettysburg. Good thing for him, because most of the men in his unit were killed, injured, or captured in the battle. Then, and this was key for Irene's future, Mose switched sides and joined a Union regiment, which entitled him to an Army pension for life.
Yeah, it was on both sides. Oh boy, it was a mess. I mean, a mess.
This may have been what attracted his much younger second wife. The heart wants what the heart wants, and sometimes that's a guaranteed monthly pension payment. As a dependent child of a veteran who had, in the nick of time, served on the winning side, Irene was entitled to government support for life.
It is a good story. It keeps on getting better.
Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln said early in the Civil War, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." But why? Besides the fact that he was born there, what else does it have besides that blue grass? The important part was the state's northern border, most of which was the Ohio River. Confederate interference, or God forbid, control of the waterway would be an enormous roadblock for the Union. If you're having flashbacks to the New Orleans stuff we talked about before, thanks for paying attention. And then there were the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, key invasion routes into the South in the event Kentucky stayed with the Union. At the top of the war, Kentucky declared itself neutral, probably because they were a state of slaveholders that also had important cultural and economic ties to the North.
I'm so conflicted.
A neutral Kentucky unwilling to cooperate with Union war aims was much better for the South than a Union-allied Kentucky. But once again, the South absolutely biffed this opportunity. In April 1861, the Louisville Journal reported a senator from Georgia saying that the border states would have to do all the fighting, which would allow the rest of the South to go about its business raising slaves and cotton. Being a border state, Kentucky didn't like that attitude, and they liked it even less when the Confederate Congress banned the export of cotton to the North. The tipping point was the Confederate invasion of Kentucky. They seized the small city of Columbus, Kentucky as part of a failed plan to take the port of Paducah. Suddenly, the Union's invitation to join them was very appealing, and Kentucky did so on September 18, 1861. There were 11 Confederate states, but the Confederate flag has 13 stars because the South so desperately wanted to manifest the addition of Kentucky and Missouri to the CSA fold. And math's hard. As you probably know, it didn't happen, although both states did have Confederate-side governments. The capital of Kentucky's alt government was Bowling Green, which it lost to Union forces in early 1862. But in a radical departure from actual logic, Confederate Missouri set up its capital in Marshall, Texas. In case geography class is a distant or non-existent memory for you, Texas is nowhere near Missouri. Marshall was an important manufacturing hub for the South and eventually became the capital of the Confederate West, but still, nowhere near Missouri. So what's up with that?
That makes no sense.
At first, Missouri tried to be neutral like Kentucky, but the Union strategically placed units around the state, solidifying control of all important St. Louis. Are you catching the river theme yet? The Union's smart maneuvers essentially took St. Louis and the state capital of Jefferson City out of the running for the shadow government, so why not Texas? At least the state's southern figureheads, or rather officials, were sitting pretty hundreds of miles away from the fighting, although what they actually did from there isn't clear. The obvious answer is geography is hard too.
She was looking for geology and misread the sign. Yeah, I said, we do not study countries in here.
The Union worked hard to keep outside powers, particularly strong European countries, from officially recognizing the Confederacy as a legit government. The North worried that manufacturing nations who depended on raw Southern cotton to feed their industry, especially Britain, would back the South to keep their looms running. Fortunately, aggressive Union diplomacy, the South's repeated blunders, European unease with backing a government of slaveholders, and crises at home kept Europe mostly on the sidelines, with one exception. The outlier was the little duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a small state that existed before Germany congealed into a unified country. It wasn't a financial or industrial power, and it wasn't especially easy to find on a map.
Never heard of it.
It's quite small.
Told you geography is hard. Nevertheless, Consul Ernst Raven from plucky little Saxe-Coburg-Gotha arrived in Texas in 1861, bringing his country's official support along with him. But Saxe-Coburg-Gotha soon joined the Confederacy on the list of countries that no longer exist. It was rolled up under the umbrella of the German Empire in 1871 and formally dissolved with the rest of Germany's hereditary monarchies in 1918 after World War I. In case that name's been on the tip of your tongue this whole time, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha's major export was Prince Albert, the guy who married Britain's Queen Victoria. He's not the one in the can. That was his son, the future Edward VII. Judah Benjamin was one of the most colorful and controversial members of the Confederate government. Born into a Jewish family in the West Indies, he immigrated to New Orleans as a child and later built a successful career as a lawyer. He represented Louisiana in the U.S. Senate in 1852. He later joined the Confederate government as Attorney General, then Secretary of War, and finally Secretary of State. When it was clear that the Confederacy was crumbling, Benjamin knew it was time to go. So sometime in early May, with the war over but the Confederate government still scuttling through the ruined South, Benjamin took off. The details of his escape are slim and heavily mythologized. One account has him pretending to be French. But since Benjamin never wrote his memoirs and burned his personal papers before his death, we'll never know what really happened. What we do know is that he was the only major member of the Confederate government to successfully escape the imploding South. He made it to Havana and then to Britain, where he revived his law career. And after his death in 1884, he was buried in Paris's famed Père Lachaise Cemetery. During the Civil War, Black Americans, often freedmen who'd been liberated by the Union Army, served with distinction, under Union colors, obviously. But in early 1865, one of the "we'll try anything stupid once" ideas the dying South had was to arm enslaved men and order them to fight for the soon-to-be lost cause that wanted to keep them enslaved. Really, Confederacy? No surprise, it went badly. Arguments raged about whether the enslaved men should be freed in exchange for their service. The men in question were suspected of taking up for the South in order to escape across Union lines. Shocker, that one. And the Confederate establishment was so jittery about putting weapons in the hands of men they treated as possessions that very few were actually conscripted into the fight for Richmond.
You remember me?
Just a few weeks later, the Confederacy was done, and soon thereafter, slavery was abolished in the United States. The legend of the lost Confederate gold is alive and well and aggressively fueling History Channel search parties, and there is at least some truth to the story. In 1934, 2 Baltimore boys found a cache of gold coins, and in 2023, a Civil War-era gold hoard was found in Kentucky. The Confederacy was bad at record keeping, and geography and math, as you now know. And the chaos of war meant that assets could easily go missing. One such jackpot was the remains of the Confederate Treasury, which limped south through Virginia and the Carolinas with Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government, who were on the run after the fall of Richmond. Much of this money was used to pay Confederate soldiers returning home, but $250,000, in 1865 money no less, was stolen by bandits. Much of it was never recovered, and treasure hunters hold on to the hope some of it is still hidden somewhere in rural Georgia. Wilkes County, right around the city of Washington, ironically enough, is the place that persistently is the rumored location, but nothing's ever been found there. The idea of hot air balloons as weapons of war might sound silly, but these impractical modes of transport were used by both the Union and Confederate forces looking for a bird's-eye view of the enemy. Inflated with gas or portable hydrogen generators, Civil War military balloons could carry 1 to 5 men.
This civilian is going to direct my fire from that balloon, sir?
Both sides sent up manned reconnaissance balloons during the 7 Days Campaign, when the Confederates pushed back Union attempts to capture Richmond despite Union balloons having eyes on the city's downtown. But a little earlier in the war, Union General John Porter had an alarming experience when the observation balloon he was in broke loose from its tether and drifted over Confederate lines. Hotshots notwithstanding, Porter drifted back into Union-held territory and safely descended, going on to sketch the Confederate positions he'd observed. The Union program was disbanded in 1863, although a fragmentary account exists of balloon use during the siege of Petersburg in 1864. Confederate efforts petered out after one balloon fell prey to friendly fire and another was captured. It's hard to understate the sheer scale of World War II, so maybe it'll come as no surprise to find that beneath all the heroics and atrocities, there are still a few mysteries that haven't been solved, even to this day. For the people of Los Angeles, February 25, 1942 is one of the tensest days of the entire war. On this day, in the early morning hours, military personnel and civilians alike were alerted to an incoming bombing raid over the city. Searchlights swept across the night sky while people sat in their blacked-out homes, quietly wondering if Japanese forces had been emboldened by their attack on Pearl Harbor months earlier. Their fears seemed to be confirmed when anti-aircraft guns began going off around 3 a.m., first in Santa Monica and then across the rest of the region. Troops were even ordered to open fire where some had seen an object floating through the sky. But when the smoke cleared, there was no sign of any attempted Japanese attack. 5 people died as a result of the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, 3 from a car accident and 2 from heart attacks, while a few buildings were damaged by anti-aircraft shells that hadn't detonated in the air. So what happened? Well, the Secretary of the Navy basically chalked it up to nerves, calling the whole thing a false alarm based on faulty radar readings. Some witnesses swore they saw enemy airplanes soaring through the sky, however, while others suggested a weather balloon might have been to blame. A small number of people even claimed that it was all down to flying saucers. Sadly, nobody has ever produced any strong evidence one way or another. World War II aircraft crews had plenty to worry about, to say the least. Flying comes with its own difficulties even in peacetime, such as navigation and the need to refuel. But when you're flying in a war zone, you also need to deal with, enemies. But by far the strangest hazard of all for World War II era aircraft were Foo Fighters. And no, we don't mean these guys. Foo Fighters were first reported by the Associated Press in 1945, though Allied flight crews had been seeing them at least a year before that. These crews often reported seeing balls of light that behaved strangely, typically following other planes and then peeling off or simply disappearing after a matter of minutes. Some of them even flashed and flew in formation, leading some airmen to believe that they were enemy weapons. But there are no reports that Foo Fighters ever attacked or otherwise harmed any aircraft or its occupants. They didn't even register on radar. So if these weird lights weren't German weapons, then what were they? Many have blamed combat fatigue that plagued hard-working crews, though many of the airmen themselves rankled at the idea that they had basically been hallucinating. One common suggestion, the visible electrical discharge known as St. Elmo's fire, doesn't really explain the strange movements of these lights either. Despite a CIA investigation in 1953, no one has ever been able to come up with a satisfactory answer for them. In 1941, a Scottish farmer found a burning plane in his field and a strange man standing beside it. The man claimed to be someone named Captain David Horn, but it soon became clear that was a blatant lie. In fact, Horn was a real Nazi politician named Rudolf Hess, who had flown from Germany to Scotland, evading anti-aircraft artillery and radar detection along the way until finally crash landing in that field. But why would such a high-ranking member of the Nazi regime leave his position and literally throw himself into the heart of enemy territory? Hess claimed he wanted to broker peace between the Nazis and sympathetic British officials, but many remained skeptical of this claim. Some simply believed that Hess was mentally ill. His genuine shock that he was treated as a prisoner and not a diplomat after being arrested certainly didn't help his case in that regard. After his arrest and subsequent imprisonment, Hess apparently realized that he was in very dire straits indeed. He attempted suicide on multiple occasions during the course of the war, but survived to be jailed in the Allied-controlled Spandau prison. Finally, in 1987, the 93-year-old Hess was found dead in prison.
One of Adolf Hitler's most fanatical followers, his deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, died today at the age of 93.
His death was ruled as a suicide, although his son has repeatedly insisted, albeit with no supporting evidence, that he was actually murdered by British intelligence. Nearly a year to the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Navy radar spotted a single aircraft approaching the area on course from Japan. They quickly scrambled 2 planes to intercept the newcomer, and the pilots reported spotting an American P-40 fighter that had been riddled with bullet holes. The pilot inside apparently waved at them, but appeared to be covered in blood. The plane crashed on land soon after, but inspection of the wreckage showed no evidence that there had ever been a pilot in the first place. So where did the plane come from? Who was its pilot? And most importantly, can the story even be believed? Well, the bad news is that this tale is almost certainly made up. It shares a close resemblance to a story written by Robert Lee Scott Jr., a writer who also served as a pilot during World War II. Scott later said that he and a fellow pilot had come up with the story to stay entertained during the long days of the war, but would never have said anything if they knew it was going to grow into an urban legend. Raoul Wallenberg is rightfully considered a hero of World War II. He was a Swedish diplomat who, through his position as deputy secretary at the Swedish embassy in Budapest, helped thousands of Jewish people flee the Nazis via Hungary. In early 1945, however, he was apprehended by Soviet officers, and despite not being accused of any particular crime, quickly disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Some wonder if the Soviets had suspected him of spying for the Americans. Others think that the Soviet Union wanted to hit Sweden hard for its pro-Nazi policies earlier in the war. Either way, Wallenberg's eventual fate has never been fully known. The Swedish government didn't do much to follow his case, as they were reluctant to become embroiled in Cold War politics. The Soviets later claimed that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in Lubyanka on July 17, 1947. But some people swore that they had crossed paths with Wallenberg as late as the 1980s. Researchers claim that there are still more records of Wallenberg's movements somewhere out there, but until the Russian government releases them, the true fate of this heroic diplomat will remain a mystery. Named for the German word for treasure hunter, Schatzgräber was a station established by the Nazis just 620 miles from the North Pole. It was strategically situated to interfere with Allied transports moving troops and supplies through the Arctic, and also provided valuable weather information to the Germans. But Schatzgräber was abandoned in 1944 when staff grew sick after eating raw polar bear meat. Hey, it happens. But why not bring in a new crew to man the station, considering how important it was to the Nazis? And why didn't anybody reveal the station's existence until well after the war in 1953? While other explanations for Schatzgräber's existence include the idea that the Nazis were conducting archaeological excavations for mysterious Nordic artifacts. Considering many Nazis were fascinated by the occult and practically revered the mystical Nordic past that they believed legitimized their regime, it's entirely possible that Schatzgräber may have been connected to this bizarre Nazi obsession. The Amber Room was located inside the Catherine Palace, a royal palace in Pushkin, Russia. Previously, it had been in St. Petersburg's Winter Palace, and before that, Prussia's Charlottenburg Palace. It was given as a gift by Prussian King Frederick William I to Peter the Great in 1716, after the Russian royal visited Frederick William's place and took a particular liking to the room. This place was seriously fancy, too. The Amber Room was constructed out of multiple tons of amber panels, each backed with gold. Later renovations added even more glitz and glamour to the room, to the point where many dubbed it the eighth wonder of the world. When invading Nazi soldiers entered the Amber Room in 1941, the panels were nowhere to be found, or at least that's what it seemed like. In fact, fleeing officials had plastered the panels with wallpaper, hoping to mask them from the invaders, but the ruse was quickly uncovered by the Germans. Just a few days later, they had shipped the amber panels to Königsberg, Germany. And that's where the disassembled Amber Room was last spotted. After that, the trail goes cold, and nobody's really sure what happened to it. Some suspect that it's now at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, after a steamer was sunk near there in 1945. Others think that the panels were destroyed in air raids, or maybe still hidden somewhere in storage.
We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top men.
There's no shortage of legends about lost Nazi treasure out there, but some of the other Axis powers figure into these mysteries too. Take Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, for example. Yamashita reportedly buried looted treasure somewhere in the Philippines while Japanese forces were occupying the nation. When he was executed by American forces in 1946, however, any hope of finding the treasure was dashed. Of course, that's assuming that it's even real. Many people have searched for Yamashita's gold in the intervening decades, despite the total lack of evidence or records supporting the tale, and have invariably come up with nothing. That hasn't deterred anyone, though. The fabled treasure hoard was even at the center of a 1988 court case brought against former Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos by a soldier named Rogelio Rojas. Rojas claimed that he had found part of that hoard, but that Marcos had promptly swooped in and seized it. A court later found in his favor and awarded Rojas his own hoard of cash in 1996. Unfortunately, by that point, Rojas had been dead for 3 years. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, though some people insist he was killed for his role in the supposed discovery of Yamashita's gold. The region of Lower Silesia in modern-day Poland was once considered to be a part of Germany. War being what it is, borders have since shifted, and the German occupants of the region fled over the course of World War II. The Polish people who took their place have since uncovered treasures left behind by their German predecessors, and as the legend goes, there may be more valuable loot still left uncovered. One of the most colorful stories claims that there is an entire underground train full of plundered Nazi treasure buried in a collapsed tunnel somewhere in Poland. It's certainly true that the Nazis built underground tunnels, and they did indeed steal cultural treasures and valuables from occupied territories. This has apparently been more than enough evidence for some treasure hunters, including one or two who insist they stumbled upon it in the past. Still, nobody has ever managed to provide the location of the Nazi gold train, or proof that it even exists at all. Towards the end of the war and in its aftermath, a number of Nazis and other fascists left Europe to escape the consequences of their defeat. Some high-placed intellectuals, like Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, were quietly rescued via Operation Paperclip, which relocated some 1,600 German scientists and their family members to America. Other Nazis disappeared from Europe at the end of the war too, with many only reappearing decades later. For example, Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina by the Mossad in 1960, while Auschwitz's so-called Angel of Death, Joseph Mengele, lived out a quiet life in Brazil until 1979. So how could these criminals have gotten so far and evaded capture for so long, with some escaping punishment entirely? Well, the escape networks used by the Nazis were eventually known as rat lines, though it's still not clear who was involved, how the rat lines ran, and how much everyone knew about the whole affair. What is clear is that many South American countries seem to be full of government officials who were more than happy to ignore the Nazis fleeing to their shores, and evidence seemed to suggest that Vatican officials also played a significant role in aiding Nazi war criminals as they fled Europe. Some have even claimed that Pope Pius XII knew more than he was letting on, though the exact nature of his involvement in the rat lines is still a mystery to this day.